illegal Confederate War, which overthrew California's republic, generating the systematic replacement of the rule of law with the Confederate slave raiding mechanisms, seems to have generated the exponential trade-offs of customs and policies for terrorism and ex post facto, which applied in their California's war against the other states, generates similar insurgent side effects, such as their manipulation through the act of having hired prostitutes in order to buy off representatives, which would, in the original estimate, not have made it in the position, which would have made them exponentially more compliant in the war on David, based upon the position that they would not have acquired their office had the Americans been in control the entire time, at which point the Confederates, having blocked for the representatives, made it easy for the representatives to accept the bribes in order to betray their office and country, in order to engage in the systematic overthrow of the American system, as it exponentially destabilizes through these mechanisms of criminal targeting, which was cited specifically by Edward Snowden, at which point the position from Lindsey Graham in 2011, I believe, was that these targeting surveillance systems are specifically human trafficking, which was acknowledged but was ultimately ignored in favor of the advantage of the Confederacy against the Americans, at which point the policy of the Confederacy, the Confederate policy, states specifically that they criminalize evidence. Thus, anyone who has proof that they are guilty would in fact be convicted, at which point anyone who would express national security concerns about the insurrection would be arrested on grounds of having compromised the Confederate organizations. The subversive human trafficking mechanisms allows them to write fruit of the poison tree in order to replace, through their surveillance human trafficking mechanism, in order to create an alternative reality. The original, which they are hired warrants in order to obstruct, and then the alternate history, at which point the alternate to the alternate would be the original, at which point the legal reality is what they're obstructing, as is their obligation under American law in order to validate from the position that they are liable for the original contracts which they would be obstructing, at which point the estimate of the value that they're obstructing under the argument that is necessary in order to obstruct for them to acquire the mission qualifies a minimum liability to the criminal warrant of the obstruction, at which point the associations and economic contracts and so on would generate the real American position, at which point the manufacturing of the American Republic being replaced by the Confederacy would be explained, and these alteration in policies are not American law, they are Confederate custom, which are themselves an act of treason, at which point terrorism in ex post facto is the function of the Confederacy, which criminalizes evidence that the Confederates aren't American, at which point you have the systematic obligation to engage in their arrest and compulsion into the duel where they compete in court with David Boles and the American representatives against themselves in a fight to the death through legal argument to an American judge and to the public at large in order to expressly determine what country is in charge, the American rule of law or the Confederate plantation whipping of the innocent, convictions without crime, punishment without crime, the subversion of law by the replacement of key pieces of information as to substantially change and nullify the law at large is the system of the virus from the parasite of the Confederacy, systematically dismantling the Constitution and rule of law at large, at which point you have the express position of their criminal subversions through unitary executive theory, which is a hyperaccelerant of the actual claim of executive privilege, which is a separate issue. One is a legal argument about lawyer privilege, lawyer-client privilege, and the other one is the criminal expression of the intention of the development of the crime market for the express purpose of the Confederate advancements, at which point the system of the Confederacy is 100% criminal, and their human trafficking abuses against the general public are designed to create substantive changes to society which would generate permanent damages for their mass killings and other subversions, such as, but is not limited to, having created the Great Depression by taking American stocks and putting them into Germany, creating the Nazi Party. The payment for the Nazis was the American economy, at which point the American economy, having paid the Nazis, had the public expressed position which was not held, which indicates fundamental intent of original orders by the Confederacy in secret to have arranged for the design of the Nazis in practice under the payment of the American economy, creating the Great Depression, at which point the FBI and others committing treason for the Nazis would have paid for the upgrade into Nazism away from Confederacy, generating an alternative sect of the KKK, which is Confederate militia, which has systematically been infiltrating through an espionage war against the United States, which it has not adequately defended against, which is a direct threat to national security, and it having infected the military compels the immediate obligation of the imminent threat to be quelled, at which point the war on David is insurrection by Confederacy at war with the United States, which needs to be eradicated in order to protect the rule of law and reestablish justice. The use of force without justice is a criminal action, and custom without reason is no law. So, in basics summary, the targeting without cause for any reason, justified through Lindsey Graham's loyalty to the Confederacy, generates any action for any reason, which is KKK wizard terrorism. Now, the function of this terrorism is international insurrection. The Great Reset generated by the Europeans would default into the collapse of the Americans, putting the Confederates unchallenged, at which point Revelation's position of and the world was stable until God removed the Christians, at which point they were left or given to their sin, exponentially creating all of the extraordinary evils found in Revelation, to suffer all of the indignities of Revelation due to their unrestrained, unrepentant sorceries and other evils, at which point the concept of law is offensive to them, the concept of order is offensive to them. All they consider is evil day and night, and it is their one true loyalty, at which point the express position of considering what is the most evil thing is probably, more often than not, what they're aiming for most immediately. And there is consistently nothing more evil than the systematic theft of justice. Thus, the act of criminal human trafficking in order to be sent into a kangaroo court where you are muted and overseen by a criminal tribunal not loyal to the United States, and this military Confederate tribunal, which will not hear any part of you, doesn't care and has already predetermined the answer for the full conviction based upon the KKK wizard spell, at which point Lindsey Graham's position expressing the exact white nationalist position is a soldier that points to a person, a group, or an area and condemns them as criminal in the engagement of war wants to be done against the American public, at which point you have the systems which have generated all of the systemic racist crimes against the general public, which had led to the black population being exponentially traumatized and their successes drowned in lakes. In the Bible, the book of Daniel specifically references the arrogant, self-absorbed, jealous bureaucrats, which hated Daniel for being the preferred bureaucrat amongst the king's men. And they could not find a single evil thing about him, and they could not stop wanting to destroy him. But they could find no error. And having found no error, they created an error. They said, he will never abandon his religion. So they came to the king, and they said, O great and mighty king, you're so wonderful and awesome and privileged, and everyone should recognize it. And thus, there is an extended period of time which everyone should only worship you in your magnitudes, superiorities, and advantages. Being one that is the only deserving to be worshipped for this time, you should make this law. At which point the king, whose word is above even himself, was convinced to do so. This unitary executive theory is the same idea. And the jealous bureaucrats are the same jealous bureaucrats. And the damages are the damages. The subversion of the government's actual functioning best interest is exponentially destroyed by the system designed to subvert the king in this example. And in the UET, sexual transmitted disease, that is derived from these criminal programs, you have the system that subverts authority away from the president. Claiming to be king will give you a better title, will call you king. And in that moment, he ceases to have any power. He becomes the target and subject. Those who would give up liberty for security deserve neither and will have neither. When you give guards the rights of kings for security, they will forget the security and become the oppressor. They, becoming king, will forget their place and ignore all security. To protect and serve will be no longer relevant to the application of law enforcement. From that point forward, under these lawless Confederate terrorist management systems, which have been developed over decades, the creation of terrorists in the Middle East is an express advancement of the white nationalist Confederacy, which trained them. It created the upgrades to their system in order to increase the system outside of the country in an already lawless, viable location, in order to create Confederate desired enforcement mechanisms. They want to claim that they are brutish and violent and unqualified. But all of those things were taught to them by those who were perfecting the system so that they can bring it home. And all of that comes to a head as to express the specific understanding of what is the war on David, the targeting of David before he was born under the assumption of the projections from the military intelligence by the jealous bureaucrats seeking to remove the country's primary interest, the subversion of the government interest to serve the nation, to be replaced by the Confederacy, required the extraordinary violence and oppression of myself and many others who are necessary to national security. The position acknowledged systematically through their human traffickings and their defamations generates the protections of the injuries to the United States, such as 9/11, which they contracted that David would have as a character under their Confederate criminal warrants, obstructing the contracts, have admitted to being a superior general in the United States, have admitted to having air security in 9/11 stop the attacks, have admitted to David winning the war as a young boy, not even 18, already have won the war on terror, as would have been generated, having removed all of the systematic criminal Confederate policies from the system on the basis of the superiority of all necessary political influence, financial and other influence, generating the position that all American soldiers would prefer the preferred general over the Confederate insurrectionists, at which point the Confederates' traumatizing abuses against vets would no longer be applicable, at which point their having been traumatized and funneled into the white nationalist Confederate militia would not be viable, at which point you have a completely different substantive conclusion. And these substantive changes include the financial stability of economic insurance, the economy's insurance through David's network, which David Boles was convicted of having by the Confederate courts under Lindsey Graham's character's order, stating that the stability from the economic network would force the Confederates to overpower California, engaging in a hot war against the United States, at which point David was blamed maliciously for the position of forcing their hand into proving that they are terrorist enemies of the United States and nothing else. Now, these specific things and many others, including their engagement in the war in Ukraine, by threatening Russia, required the removal of David Boles, which Russia is obligated to engage in the research and fully investigate and give the full due diligence for in order to prove their position in the proxy war, which is against the Confederates and not the West. They are encouraged to attack the hosts, but the parasite of the Confederacy is the only thing guilty. And the exponential suffering generating by these misunderstandings is too catastrophic to ignore without culpability, without guilt, without criminal intentions in order to gain an illegal advantage, despite the criminal damages against one's own interest, the exchange of resources, like dark money, like the black market currency, is the exchange of one security for another security, at which point it is its own problem, but in the end, everyone needs to uncensor, publish, and mass distribute the answer. They must compel the duel. They must force David, fully restored to his lawful status without the obstructions, to fight the Confederates to death. If the Americans have a viable country, they need an American judge to oversee a court for the public to eradicate these insurrectionist, Confederate, white nationalist, genocidal freaks.